I learned my marriage was over because the Harbor Crest Theater security system noticed before I did. I had barely stepped into the executive entrance before a quiet alert appeared on my tablet, flagging a guest credential that carried access no visitor should have received. When I looked up, Owen Prescott was walking through the lobby with Simone Archer at his side, greeting sponsors as though they had been attending opening nights together for years. He rested his hand lightly against her back and smiled while telling a donor, "Abigail is moving toward something different. Simone will be joining me on several future projects." And no one questioned the sentence because it sounded polished enough to become truth. I kept walking instead of interrupting him because something around Simone's neck mattered more than whatever Owen had chosen to say. The silver credential hanging from her lanyard belonged to a restricted access level my department had rejected the previous week, after determining she had no operational role inside our theater network. That credential could only exist if someone with executive authority had bypassed the normal approval process, and every override automatically created a permanent digital record. I turned away from the reception area before anyone could stop me with sympathetic smiles or awkward explanations, knowing the system would answer questions far more honestly than the people gathered around my husband. Dana Brooks was already waiting inside the compliance office with the final certification package required before the evening performance could legally begin. She slid a tablet across the desk without mentioning Owen or Simone, then quietly said, "We received an access exception 20 minutes ago, and the audit log doesn't match the approval chain." I opened the report and found Simone's credential immediately, followed by the exact timestamp, the executive override, and the account that had authorized everything. Owen's name appeared beside every change, without a single missing entry. And suddenly the conversation waiting outside no longer mattered, because the evidence sitting in front of me could not be argued into becoming something else. I closed the report, looked back at Dana, and answered, "Don't release the final certification yet. We're verifying every exception before anyone signs." Dana kept Simone's credential on the screen while she opened every approval, and the timeline assembled itself without room to guess. The original request had been denied through the review path, then reopened through an executive override less than an hour later. A second change expanded Simone's access beyond donor areas and into restricted corridors where outside guests were never permitted. Dana studied the entries, then looked at me and said, "Every exception came from Owen's account, and none passed through compliance." I asked her to preserve the records exactly as they appeared, including the denial, override, and each adjustment tied to the credential. She created a copy while I watched the timestamps remain fixed across the audit history, with no missing entries or sign of failure, because an executive had bypassed a control designed to protect staff and production areas. Dana contacted Marcus Doyle under company policy rather than treating it as a marital dispute. Marcus asked, "Can the record stand without Abigail's interpretation?" And Dana answered, "Yes. The approval chain is complete." My phone began vibrating before their call ended, and Owen's name appeared twice before a message replaced it. "Where are you? We need the final certification." I read the words once, set the phone beside the tablet, and returned to the audit log because his urgency did not change what his account had authorized. Marcus arrived afterward, reviewed the protected copy, and compared the credential history with the access policy beside it. He never asked about Simone's relationship with Owen, and he never asked me to explain the lobby. When Marcus reached the final entry, he closed the policy document and said, "This is no longer personal. It is a governance issue, and we will handle it through the board." I confirmed only the facts within my responsibility, including that my department had rejected the original request and never approved expanded access. No accusation was necessary because every decision had been recorded before Owen entered the reception with Simone beside him. By the time Marcus secured the report, the version Owen presented outside had lost the only thing it needed to survive: control over the evidence. Owen reached the compliance office before Marcus secured the report, and his first question was not about what he had done to me. He looked at the unsigned certification and demanded, "Is tonight's performance still moving forward?" I answered that it would remain pending until every access exception had been reviewed. His expression tightened because the answer threatened his authority before it touched our marriage. He insisted Simone's credential was harmless, only a courtesy for someone supporting future partnerships. I pointed to the approval trail and replied, "A courtesy does not require 2 overrides after compliance denies it." Owen glanced toward Marcus, searching for an understanding that could make the record less permanent. Marcus gave him none, while Dana preserved the system history. Simone appeared moments later and asked to speak with me without Owen present. She did not apologize or pretend she had misunderstood our marriage, instead telling me, "I knew you were still married, and Owen knew why our connection benefited both of us." I believed that because she delivered it without shame, romance, or manufactured innocence. Then, Dana explained that Simone's credential could trigger a review of every restricted area she had entered under Owen's approval. For the first time, Simone stopped looking at me as the obstacle between her and Owen. She turned toward him and asked, "You told me this had been cleared. What else did you leave out?" Owen claimed the rules were exaggerated because people were reacting emotionally, but the audit log showed the original denial beside his override. Simone read the entries, removed the credential, and placed it on Dana's desk. She had entered the building believing she was part of Owen's future, but the record showed she was part of a decision he had concealed. I did not need to warn her because her name appeared inside the same approval chain as his. Owen had promised her influence while using access he had no right to grant. By the time she stepped away from him, Simone understood that their alliance had not placed her beside his power. It had placed her inside his exposure. Marcus called the emergency board meeting less than an hour after Simone placed her credential on Dana's desk, and the agenda never mentioned my marriage. It listed access control, governance review, and executive judgment, which meant Owen could no longer reduce the issue to a private disagreement between husband and wife. I sat beside Dana while Marcus opened the audit record, and Owen entered with the expression he used whenever he expected confidence to settle the room. That expression changed when he saw Eli Warren waiting with months of operational logs arranged beside the access report. Eli began with decisions made long before Simone entered the theater, showing how Owen had repeatedly shortened review periods and moved approvals around departments responsible for safety and compliance. None of those choices had stopped a performance, but together they revealed a pattern of treating required controls as obstacles whenever they slowed him down. Simone's credential appeared near the end, not as the center of the review, but as the clearest example of the same judgment. Dana matched each entry to policy while I confirmed only the facts belonging to my department, including the rejected request and the absence of later compliance approval. Owen argued that the theater had opened safely under his leadership and that no guest had been harmed by the changes. Marcus did not raise his voice when he answered, "This meeting is not measuring whether you were lucky. It is measuring whether you followed the standards attached to your authority." The room returned to the records, and Owen's defense narrowed with every page because results could not erase the process he had bypassed. By the end, no one had asked how long Owen and Simone had been involved, what he had promised her, or what he had said about me outside. Marcus directed Dana to continue the governance review, ordered Eli to preserve the supporting operational records, and removed any further discussion from the opening night schedule. Owen sat silent after realizing the board was no longer deciding whether he had made a personal mistake. They were deciding whether a leader who ignored controls whenever they became inconvenient could still be trusted with the authority to override them. The performance remained scheduled, but Marcus changed who controlled the final decision before the house opened. Approval moved into a temporary board process, so Owen could no longer release the event on his authority alone. When he objected, Marcus answered, "You will remain informed, but you will not make the final call while the review is active." Dana documented the change, and I signed after every access exception matched the corrected list. I approved the performance because actors, crews, ushers, and technicians had spent months preparing for that night. Owen watched me sign and murmured, "So you are willing to protect the opening?" I kept my eyes on the certification and replied, "I am protecting people whose work has nothing to do with your choices." The distinction gave him no way to mistake responsibility for forgiveness. The doors opened on time. The audience took their seats, and the production began without interruption. Behind the scenes, news of Marcus's decision moved quickly through Seattle's network of presenters, donors, and arts executives. Owen had not been fired, but people understood what it meant when an operations director lost independent approval on opening night. Simone learned the same lesson when two partners postponed discussions they had nearly finalized, each citing the unresolved governance review rather than her relationship with Owen. She found him near the administrative corridor and asked, "Did you know this could reach my work?" Owen answered that people were overreacting and the board would restore his authority once the performance succeeded. Simone looked toward the credential sealed with Dana's records and replied, "The performance succeeding does not erase how I got inside." She walked away before he could turn the evening into another promise. By intermission, the first consequences had arrived, although no divorce papers existed and no public statement had been made. Owen had his title. Simone still had her position, and the audience never knew what had happened upstairs. Yet his judgment was under review. Her partnerships were cooling, and my signature had kept the theater running without restoring either of them. The marriage had not legally ended, but the future they expected from it had begun closing around their choices. The governance review concluded 2 days later, and Owen finally stopped arguing with the records because every explanation had already been measured against the audit history. He admitted he had approved the access changes himself, insisting he believed faster decisions served the organization better than slower procedures. Marcus listened without interrupting, while Dana compared Owen's statement with the documented approvals already preserved in the review file. No one challenged his honesty anymore, because the discussion had moved beyond whether he acted and toward why he believed the rules no longer applied to him. Simone spoke after Owen finished, and her voice sounded steadier than it had on opening night. She admitted she had accepted every invitation and every credential because she trusted Owen when he assured her everything had been authorized correctly. Then she looked directly at him and quietly asked, "If you knew the request had been denied first, why didn't you tell me?" Owen held her gaze for a moment before answering that he never expected the override to become an issue. And the silence that followed carried more weight than anything either of them could have added. Dana presented the board's recommendations immediately afterward, including revised approval procedures, mandatory executive review for future overrides, and temporary limits on Owen's operational authority until the governance process was complete. Marcus accepted every recommendation without modification, while Eli assumed responsibility for technical operations during the transition period. Owen remained employed, but the authority he once exercised alone would now require independent review before any exceptional decision could move forward. When the meeting ended, no one hurried toward Owen, and no one asked Simone to stay. They left through separate doors because the partnership that had seemed so confident only days earlier no longer rested on the version of events Owen had created. I gathered my documents beside Dana, watched Eli collect the operational files, and realized every person in that room would continue working under the same organization, only under different expectations. Owen had not lost everything. Simone had not become a villain, and I had not won anything that resembled revenge. What changed instead was simpler and harder to escape. Each of us now stood beside the choices we had personally made, without anyone else's image left to stand behind. The divorce moved through the Washington court without the noise, because neither Owen nor I tried to turn the filing into another contest. He did not challenge the petition, argue over property, or ask me to protect the version of our marriage he had presented to others. We met once to sign the documents, and the room felt quieter than any board meeting because nothing was left to defend. Owen looked at the final page and admitted, "I should have understood what I was risking." And I answered, "You understand it now." Before we left separately, Simone accepted a position outside Seattle, and her alliance with Owen ended without an explanation or another attempt to control how people interpreted it. The partnerships postponed during the review moved forward with other candidates, leaving her to rebuild credibility. Somewhere her judgment would not be measured against that credential. Marcus announced the revised governance structure across the theater network, requiring independent review for every executive override. Dana became the head of ethics and compliance implementation, while Eli became director of technical operations. After guiding the transition, my change arrived through the same announcement. When Marcus offered me responsibility for compliance across the West Coast division, he explained that the board wanted one standard applied across every theater, and I accepted because the position recognized work I had already been doing. Nothing about the promotion repaired my marriage, but it gave my future a direction that did not depend on Owen's title, choices, or approval. I packed my office over several afternoons while the theater continued operating under the procedures created from the review. Owen remained employed with limited authority. Simone began again elsewhere, and Marcus, Dana, and Eli carried the responsibilities their decisions had earned. I left with one box and no reason to look back at the room where the first audit record had appeared. The court documents ended the marriage, but the real ending came when each of us had to live beside our own choices without asking someone else to carry their meaning. Months later, I returned to Harbor Crest as the compliance lead for the West Coast Division, carrying responsibility that no longer sat beneath Owen's title. The lobby looked unchanged, but the people who greeted me used my name without attaching it to his. Dana's new procedures were already visible in every approval chain, and Eli's operations team moved through opening checks without shortcuts. Marcus met me near the executive corridor and said, "Everything is running the way it should." And I believed him because the records matched the room. I saw Owen before the house opened, standing beside a schedule he once would have approved alone. He still worked there, but every exception now required review, and the limits on his authority had become part of ordinary business rather than public punishment. He looked at me, paused, and offered, "You seem well." I answered, "I am," and nothing in either voice asked for another ending. Simone had rebuilt her career elsewhere. Dana led ethics and compliance across the network, and Eli held the operational authority he had earned during the transition. Marcus remained responsible for the structure that kept one person's judgment from becoming everyone else's risk. None of them disappeared, and none escaped what their decisions had changed. The consequences had become quieter, but they were still present in every role, every approval, and every door that now required the right person to open it. When the lights dimmed, I took my seat without checking whether Owen was watching or whether anyone remembered opening night. The performance began on time, and the calm around me felt different because it no longer depended on keeping someone else comfortable. I had not defeated Owen, and Simone had not replaced me. We had simply reached lives shaped by the choices we made. Some separations do not leave a winner. Only people who finally stop asking the wrong life to prove their worth.